Serious, soldiers of Reddit who fought in Afghanistan, what preconceptions did you have that turned out to be completely wrong? Was in the Tangi Valley, and we had 2 of our 4 of HMMWVS broke in the middle of a town. The whole village male population came out to help us dig out our vehicles. Talking like 100 to 200 people who were digging in right next to us and with us. Sun went down and it started to snow. Everyone left. We got attacked that night. The villagers didn't want us there. Not because they hated us, but because they knew their mud huts were about to get up in the attack that would happen that night. Christmas Eve, I think 2010. My perception that was completely wrong is that all the locals hate you and they want to try and kill you 24/7. As I stated, that is completely wrong, and it was the opposite of that. The local Afghan population, and ironically the Taliban, were extremely nice to us. They would rather have us there than the Taliban. Where I was stationed was the heroin capital of Afghanistan. I actually believe in the world as well. We were also told that the majority of the Taliban were from this area as well. Because of this, a lot of them didn't want to fight in their own backyards. The locals were happy with us because we kept the peace and helped them out as much as we can in a combat environment. We actually brought an economic boost for them as well. The local shop owners loved us because we would always buy monsters, pop, cigarettes, and chips off of them. We would buy food off of other locals on a weekly basis. Oh yeah, that's another perception I had that was wrong. Those can cook. And I mean cook. They had the best chicken and potatoes, and made the best bread. As I stated already, the Taliban soldiers didn't have a problem with us either. There are many times we would hear that the higher up Taliban leaders would call the local guys and flip the out on them because they aren't trying to kill us, and the local dudes would just be like, hey man, we are good. They are good. They aren't doing anything to harm us. We just want to chill. They will be gone sooner or later. I'm not you. That's how their conversations went. There would even be times that the Taliban were forced to do their job, that they would have other local people place the IEDs and make them soaking obvious, like textbook IED laying, so we can see it from a mile away so none of us would get hurt and they can pass it on and say they did their job. This was great to write. Thank you for asking. It's pretty rare that someone asks you anything about being in Afghanistan other than did you kill anyone. It's nice to talk about it. Edit. Thank you to whoever gifted me gold. Soldiers tend to train for fighting at sub 500 meters. At least I always had. Not being able to see the enemy wasn't completely out of the norm for training, but they were usually within the effective range of our small arms. Come to Afghanistan, and we were getting fired at by invisible enemies on the side of mountains a kilometer plus away. We hardly knew we were getting engaged, let alone went into contact drills. When I was told I was going to Afghanistan, I was picturing mountains and all that stuff they have in the eastern part of the country. I went to southern Afghanistan. It's mostly desert, but around the rivers it's a king jungle. I spent many patrols wading through knee to waist deep water and mud in pomegranate and grape orchards. Most of my training leading up to deploying to Afghanistan had been geared towards urban operations and convoy operations. What I ended up doing was small, squad-sized dismounted patrols through rough terrain. Also didn't expect to be as close to the enemy as we usually were. Usually less than 50 meters was our engagement distance. Their concept of food. In their culture, if anyone had food they were to share it with everyone around them. This is even if you only have enough for one person to have a snack. It was almost as if they didn't believe food could be owned by a person. Some of the Afghans I worked with would be offended if I ate anything and didn't offer them some. I guess also that I would actually be working with some Afghans. I didn't expect that to be a thing. That Afghanistan was an actual country. It's only so on a map. The people, in some of the more rural places, at least, have no concept of Afghanistan. We were in a village in northern Kandahar province, talking to some people who of course had no idea who we were or why we were there. This was in 2004. Not only had they not heard about 9/11, they hadn't heard Americans had come over. Talking to them further, they hadn't heard about that one time the Russians were in Afghanistan either. We then asked if they knew where the city of Kandahar was, which is a rather large and important city some 30 miles to the south. They'd heard of it, but no one had ever been there, and they didn't know when it was. For them, there was no Afghanistan. The concept just didn't exist. Oh, also about the fighting we did. I had in my mind that it would be these organized ambushes against a somewhat organized force. It may have been like that for the push, Marja, but once the initial defense was scattered, the fighting turned into some farmer getting paid a year's salary to go fire an AK-47 at our patrol as we walked by. I mean, no wonder there was so much PTSD going around. It doesn't feel okay when you killed some farmer for trying to feed his kids or save his family from torture that next night. It feels like actually that we would be fighting the Taliban. The majority of people we managed to detain had been coerced into shooting at us by the Mujahideen, which is made up of all sorts of people who had kidnapped or threatened their family. The most glaring example of this was when our FOB, forward operating base, was attacked by a massive VBIED truck bomb that blew a hole in our wall. Suicide bombers ran into the FOB through the hole and blew themselves up in our bunkers. Every single one of them had their hands tied and remote detonation receivers, so they couldn't back out. That everyone was going to be dirty and poor like in those help a poor starving child commercials. I remember being really surprised to see kids running around, playing in dirt roads and everyone was clean. No dirt smudges on their face or anything. Also there were these two little girls with the most unbelievably white dresses I have ever seen, standing by the side of the road watching our convoy roll by. Very surreal. That it was all arid desert. At one point in my deployment my team had to dig irrigation trenches because our tents were flooded past our ankles. At another point in my deployment I was trudging through what was essentially a jungle. Deployed in 2011, my misconception was that we were going to help the Afghans have better lives. Like you/Zatanna said on here, most of them just wanted to be left alone and didn't care at all about whether they had democracy or the Taliban. We would do anything we could to get people to talk to us and give us any information on the Taliban and Haqqani. Most said nothing, but some were honest. Look, what good will it do me to talk to you? You will leave soon. They will still be here. What are you going to do for me? My brother was kidnapped last week. Have any Americans been doing anything about that? Can you protect me and my family? If something happens to us, can I count on you? Of course, we would try to sound positive and helpful without making promises, and try to act like of course, we're here to help you. But protecting Afghan civilians was not the priority. Not that we would intentionally endanger them, but we would never go out of our way just to save or protect a local. Force protection is the name of the game. And I get it. It's the military, not a humanitarian NGO. Certain missions take priority, and you can't risk lives needlessly. I just thought that we might have put more effort into winning trust. I'd have to say this is not a perception, but rather a culture shock. I was never part of any interrogations, but I was told that some of the Taliban we had been fighting believed we had force fields that were causing their weapons, most notably RPGs, to not hit us. It had nothing to do with skill of the user or the weapon's capabilities. They actually believed our technology was that superior. I want to reiterate what /you/stay thirsty my friend one commented. Before I first deployed I too felt that we were going to support the Afghans in working towards their own independence and stability. Instead I realized we were not supporting them so much as propping up a system that they could not or had no interest in propping up themselves. I fully admit that I'm jaded, and I probably saw a small slice of what was really going on. However, I've heard so much of the same from so many service personnel that I feel that it is systemic. I deployed with 3rd Marine Battalion, 5th Regiment to Helmand Province, and then later with TU/5 to the same province. What I saw there was massive incompetence on the part of the ANA and ANP, Afghan National Army/Police. This wasn't the sort of incompetence brought on by lack of training. This was incompetence due to the absence of motivation and will. There were many occasions where we had to force ANA and ANP to do their jobs. It was a huge 180 from what we were told in training prior to deployment. My second preconception was the level of poverty. I had seen pictures of Iraq and some of the guys in my unit had deployed there, but none of them had been to Afghanistan. I equate it to stepping into another world. It's crazy to think of a family of 12 with the only assets to their name is a small 15 FTX 15-foot hut and a sick goat. I saw so much poverty and the standard of living was very poor even to what you'd imagine a third world country would be. It really opened my eyes as a sheltered white middle-class kid from the United States. Third was how built up some of the bases / fobs were. When I first arrived into Camp Leatherneck / Bastion, I was honestly in awe of how much like a base in California it was. Civilian contractors everywhere, with corporate business logos everywhere you looked. The chow halls were better than the states, the accommodations were great, and heated / conditioned. There were even decent Wi-Fi connections, and it was incredible how much logistics we had. When I eventually moved to the real fobs, I'd be working out, it became more to my expectations, but much more built up than I ever expected. I'd say my last major preconception was combat / deployment itself. Doesn't really have to do with Afghanistan itself. I expected constant warfare to be like in movies with gunfire and artillery everywhere. Obviously in hindsight, that was incredibly naive. In reality it was very boring and monotonous 90% of the time. Working parties, maintenance, and guard post were dull. Patrols and convoys were also dull in a way, however IEDs and ambushes were common, IEDs being the most. So here I'd be on a patrol tired for lack of sleep to being on a guard shift the night before, bored of seeing the same landscape for months on end, and constantly fighting with myself to stay alert for danger, and not fall into complacency. Simply put, deployment for me was a huge mental game of fighting to stay sharp and alert under the massive weight of boredom and tedium. That it was really a war. It's just people sustaining other people, with a lot of nothing actually getting done. As someone who was a gunner for most of my tour, we mainly did transportation missions from Kabul to the eastern province. We never saw any action, and to this day I thank God for that. The fact that a lot of my time outside of convoys was spent either sleeping, eating, or gaming surprised me, I suppose, but in the end, we are just there to provide presence, and not expected to actually accomplish anything. The amount of awards given out back in Kabul for people simply hitting a high quota of maintenance repairs threw me off too. There were times when I was looked down upon for not working every day in a shop and instead being on convoys. The worst part of it all was losing a friend to suicide after returning home safe. That was something I never expected to see happen, and it still messes with me to this day. I've been to 11 other countries during my 5 years in the Marines. Went there expecting the people to be chanting for our death and plotting nefarious acts of villainy all the time. Which, certainly, there are a few out there. For the most part though, people the world over are the same with minor outliers. Afghans are not an exception here. They mostly just want to be left alone, tend their land and their family. They're almost exactly the same as anyone who grew up in the deep south, just a different flavor of religion. Most interesting to me is how their history is passed down each generation. It's all word of mouth, for generation after generation, and largely focused on the wars they fought. The end result is you'll have elders in the mountains who'll swear that their great-great-grandfather fought against Alexander the Great. That they had any idea why we were there. We'd ask them if they knew what 9/11 was, and they had no idea. We'd show them pictures of the WTC on fire after the planes hit, and ask them what it was. Their response was usually that it was a picture of a building the US bombed in Kabul, their capital. Kind of mind-blowing that they're being occupied by a foreign military force, and have no idea why.